I am Cappy Powell, president of the Johann Fust Library Foundation Board. The mission of the foundation is to maintain and preserve the buildings and gardens of the library while providing a literary and cultural center for the residents and visitors of Boca Grande. This beautiful facility was built in 1950, 74 years ago. It was renovated in 2013. Siebert Architects received an award from the Florida Association of the American Institute of Architects for its work on the renovation. The foundation owns and maintains all of the original library grounds, gardens, and buildings. Lee County rents the library space from the foundation. The foundation also owns a fine collection of artifacts and rare books. I think we can agree that this pink building, with its Bermuda roof, massive cypress doors, is one of the most iconic buildings in Boca Grande, but it also has a rich history. This year, for the very first time, the foundation is offering docent tours of our buildings and grounds. On the tour, you can learn more about the Bermuda roof, the cypress doors, our wonderful shell collection. You will go in the stacks and visit with the Lee County librarian and hear about our history with Lee County. And you can get a glimpse of the artifacts and rare books. The tours are offered on Wednesday afternoons at 2 o'clock. They last about 45 minutes. Like all of our programs, we do not charge for the tour, but we do ask that you make a reservation. There isn't very much room in the artifacts room for a lot of people. To learn more about this library, which has been at the core of the Boca Grande Community Center for almost 75 years, please go to our website or call the foundation office to sign up for a docent tour. The volunteer docents have been working very hard to have a wonderful presentation for you. Each season, the foundation offers a literary series in this courtyard. Today's program is the 5th in the 2023-24 season. On behalf of our foundation board, I am pleased to welcome you to the Art and Science of Literary Research, where we will hear from 4 local authors, Candice Hooper, Susan Hanafee, Linda Fairstein, and Bobbie Marquis. Welcome.
Thank you, Cappy. I am honored to be appearing here today with these 3 writers whose works I greatly admire and who put me in charge of facilitating this program because I was late to the organizing meeting. I'm delighted also to see so many other Boca Grande writers here, many of them in the first couple of rows, and neighbors and friends who are just interested in understanding a bit more about the research that goes into all forms of writing. Today, our format will be for the 4 of us to briefly introduce ourselves and talk a bit about the importance and the role of research in what we write. After that, I'll pose some questions, and then we'll open up for questions from you. So please be ready to ask us anything and everything. So let me introduce myself. I'm Candice Hooper, and I am a nerd. I've had my nose in a book since before kindergarten, and I wrote a family newspaper when I was in 1st grade. Fortunately, no copies survive. My undergraduate degree was in journalism, which is often called the first draft of history. So it's probably no wonder that I ended up writing history. But my first love was fiction, specifically mysteries, specifically Nancy Drew. The thrill of the hunt. And I think that's why I've always loved research. I became a writer here on Boca Grande, and of the many wonderful things that have happened to me since I became a writer, the most special was my invitation to join the Library Foundation's Literary Advisory Board this year. I haven't had an opportunity to thank the board for this honor publicly until now, but thank you. It means so much to me. I write history, and specifically biography, it appears, is my métier. which is nonfiction. So I require research because, as you'll see on this chart that we handed out, or that was available, is available at the front, I can't make up anything when I write, unlike all of my fellow authors here on the panel. But in my writing, research is critical before, during, and after I write a book. Before, number one, I have to research my potential subject to see if there's even enough there to write about that subject. And oftentimes to find out whether I want to write about that subject, because a history book will take anywhere from 4 to 8 to 10 years to write. You want to be comfortable with your subject. Also, before you begin to write, then you start digging into the research about your subject. And you gather enough relevant information to help you structure the book that you're going to write, and enough to begin writing. During the writing of the book, I am continually researching as I try to flesh out my character, the settings, and the narrative. You know, what was the weather on this particular day? Or in my last book, what kind of flowers were blooming in Washington when Markland died? Then after I write the text and send it off to the publisher, I keep researching. Mostly at that point, I'm researching because I'm working with a cartographer on the maps that I always include with my books. I love maps. I think maps are critical to military history books in particular, and they require research on the part of the author to help the cartographer figure out what they want to show. So everything I write must come from a source. I must cite the source in either footnotes or endnotes. Archivists and librarians are wonderful, helpful professionals who are really critical to the work of historians, and we all acknowledge them in our books. For me, archives are my Disneyland. Crumbling old letters are my passes on roller coasters. Our librarian here, our chief librarian here, Tony Vanover, is a treasure who has been helpful to a legion of Boca Grande writers, including all of us here and some of us in the audience. She has appeared in countless books in acknowledgments, including both of mine, and she's already helping me on my third. So with that, I'll turn to Bobbie to introduce herself.
Thank you, Candy. Hi, everyone. My name is Bobbie Marquis, and many of you may know me because I'm here at the Johann Fust Library Foundation. I'm the executive director and have been for the last 7 years. But today, I'm wearing my writer's hat. I'm currently studying for my MFA at Spalding University's Naslin Mann School of Writing in Louisville, Kentucky. And that's the alma mater for Alice Gorman, one of our beloved fellow community members / authors / heroes. I'm passionate about fiction. And up until last fall, most of my work was in the form of short stories, but currently I'm working on a historical novel. Between 1663 and 1673, 700 young women left France and sailed to Canada, which was then called New France. Louis XIV paid their dowries, and thus they were called les filles du roi, the daughters of the king. The women were sent to New France to marry the men who were already there. They were there building forts, trapping, fishing. And in 1663, the population of New France included just 3,000 colonists, whereas the population of the New England and Chesapeake colonies, English settlers, were at 60,000. So France was really anxious to build the colony. Not only did the king pay dowries, I'm going to let that big truck go by. Not only did the king pay dowries, but he paid a bonus for every child born. The result was a population explosion. I became interested in this subject because I discovered that most of my 9th and 10th great-grandmothers on my father's side came over with this wave of filles du roi. And I began to research their lives and discovered that aside from a few basic pieces of census data, such as when they were born, when they were baptized, when they were married, when they died. The stories of these young women were lost. That's because most of them were illiterate. They wrote no letters and they wrote no journals. So research of the place and time reveals that aside from the king's interest in empire building and the mercenary interests of trappers and traders, the Catholic Church was also involved. The nuns and priests were hell-bent on converting the indigenous people. Throw 700 young French girls into the mix, and my curiosity overtook me. I embarked on a journey to learn as much as I could, and then to imagine the human dramas that were not written down. And with that, I'll pass it on to Linda Fairstein to introduce herself.
Sounds like we're all going to have a great book soon. Can you hear me? Got it. Thank you. Yeah. Wonderful to share the stage with three women and writers I adore and admire, and to be with all of you in this magnificent library. For me, everything about books started in libraries. I like Candy reading. I used to go with my mother every Saturday morning to the local library, which looked nothing like this, and take books out. I think we were only allowed 3 at a time in those days. Bring them home. And I majored in English Lit when I got to college. To my father's despair, I always said, when people said, ask, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'd say, I want to be a writer. And I loved him, I adored him, and he would groan and say, you have nothing to write about, get a career. Honest. And so I went to law school straight from college, meeting today Ross Wales, who I haven't seen since the fall of 1969 when we started law school together. After law school, went to the New York County District Attorney's Office and was a prosecutor there for 30 years. For 26 of those years, ran the country's pioneering sex crimes prosecution unit, which was work that I never thought I would want to do. The district attorney didn't give me a choice because there were so few women on the legal staff, and he thought it would be important for women to be received by other women. So so that was 72 to 2002. I started writing a nonfiction book because I was asked to describe the work of our unit. And I've had published 24 books. The first was the nonfiction sexual violence about our work. And after that, getting to what I always wanted to do, 20 crime novels. So they're a series. And what I wanted to do in the series was explore the professional work that I was doing and make it enlightening to people who didn't want to go near this dark subject. But the other thing was, like Candy, I love crime novels. I never like the ones that are just shootouts and car chases and you have a 2.5-hour read and you are done with the book. I love books in which I learn something. So I set everyone, except my first book, in a New York City landmark. And my research, which was a joy for me, was also an effort to give something to the reader at the end of the hours spent with the book. And so I used settings like the Museum of Natural History, the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I went into the tunnels, the water tunnels that are 600 feet down beneath the city, and some of the great hospitals in New York. I just had a history lesson for myself by getting into these places and then using the landmark as the location of either the crime or some aspect of the major setting in the series, which has been great fun for me, and also because you learn so much doing the research. It keeps me engaged and interested as I spend 18 months or so trying to craft the book. And the other 3 books that I've published are because of my childhood affection for Nancy Drew. They are an homage to Nancy Drew. They're for 9 to 12-year-olds, and they feature a 12-year-old protagonist whose mother happens to be the first woman police commissioner of New York City, a job I dearly wanted in the 1990s, and nobody would pay attention to that. But they're mysteries, and they're also meant to be about a smart kid. So she sneaks into her mother's office to get access to facial recognition software when she's seen a crime occur. And again, I use real settings that a kid would go to in New York. So great fun to write them, and even more fun to talk about them. So I pass to Susan.
Thanks. Excuse me, I'm Susan Hanafee, and Carolyn Madden at the Tide. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that better? I flunked mic turning on. And I was talking to Carolyn Madden the other day, and we both agreed that you need to write more of those children's stories. So if you haven't seen her books, they're just terrific, all of them. So when I was a reporter for the Indianapolis Star for 30 years, starting back in the 60s, I had a research project every day, and I had 9 hours total to get it done, but 6 hours to do the research, and then maybe an hour to write it. It had to be accurate because people like these research ladies down here, 100 years from now might be reading my stories. So there was a lot of pressure, but it was so much fun. And of course, I had a lot of curiosity, and that sort of guided me as a journalist. I wanted to know everything. I still like to watch movies. I'm looking to see, when did that person die? Who were they married to? I drive my partner crazy. But anyway, so I carried my curiosity over to my current avocation, which is mystery writer. And my mysteries are set on Boca Grande, and I've published 3, and I have a 4th one that's available under the sand at the Tide in limited copies, because it's kind of a test book, and you all get to read it and tell me what you think of it. So I like to say that my novels are 80% truth, masquerading as fiction. So the idea for this book began when Mark Spurgeon and I were chatting one day. You all know Mark Spurgeon. And he said, "Did I tell you about the woman that was buried alive on the island over here, and then they found her and stuff?" And I thought, I'd never heard that story before. Well, it turned out that he wasn't exactly right. It wasn't in an island around here. It was someplace in Georgia. But I kind of tucked that in the back of my mind. And then fast forward to 2023, when we had all these terrible problems after the hurricane with communication. And so I was lying in bed one night thinking about, the hurricane problems and everything. And I thought, what if a group of bad guys sabotaged the Causeway Bridge and then blew up the cell tower, cut off all communications to the outside world? And I'd actually been told by a friend of mine that the Causeway Bridge is kind of an easy target. And we all remember how I don't want to scare you. Remember how Hurricane Ian destroyed the cell tower and the bakery. So my disturbed thoughts continued, and I thought, what if when the island is cut off, these people come onto the island by boat and kidnap a billionaire and his brother? And they leave notes saying that these 2 men are going to be held captive and buried alive until ransom is paid. So, and what if the sheriff is off island and unreachable, and the only people left, besides my 2 characters, Wes and Leslie, are the rookie deputy and the island iguana hunter? So those are the only people with weapons. And, I'm sorry to say, in the dog days of summer, there's a good chance law enforcement could be scarce. So that's how the newest book was born. But the real kidnapping victim was a woman named Barbara Jane Mackle. I don't know if you remember or not. She was kidnapped in the 60s, yes. And she was on her way home for Christmas break, and a disgruntled employee of her father, who was a Florida real estate developer, kidnapped her, and they put her in a fiberglass box in someplace in Georgia, not on an island around here. So my first research for this book was to read her book called 83 Hours Till Dawn. I found this kind of beaten up copy, paid $30 for it on the internet. And it was written by a reporter from the Miami Herald named Gene Miller. So I named my iguana hunter Gene Miller. But if I wanted to know what it felt like to be buried alive, her book gave me every terrifying detail. It was quite fascinating. So finding and reading Jean's book was just the beginning of the kind of research you have to do even for fiction. So for like chapter 2 of this book, I needed to know what kinds of car Kia manufactured in 2015. I needed to know how much people in Las Vegas pay for a personally autographed photo of Pete Rose. And I also needed to know how Swing Bridge operated and all sorts of details. So that was just the beginning. And as I think, as you can surmise, the need for accuracy and thus research never stops if an author wants his or her book to be believable and enjoyable.
Thank you all. So let's just very, very briefly describe what kinds of sources you look for. Now, Susan, you've already given us a good example of that. But the question is, are you looking in files, letters, interviewing living people, internet? Bobbie?
Well, I would love to look at letters, and I would love to look at journals. But as I mentioned, the illiteracy was prevalent with the women, and my focus is on the girls, one girl in particular, who becomes the main character. But there are letters that have been written by the Jesuits that gives a lot of insight as to how they thought, and by the nuns, because they were educated and literate. But other than that, it's mostly academic history books that have been well researched and written by university professors. That's where I find my most reliable research. But I really would like to get out on the St. Lawrence River in a canoe, and I'd like to cross the Atlantic in a wooden ship, but I don't know if that's going to happen.
So, Linda, how do you do your research? And because you're going around New York, has anybody ever tried to stop you from researching something?
Yes, I think it's really critical when you're doing research and writing about a real place that you get into that place so you know what it looks like and smells like and what the unusual aspects are. Some of you know from New York or other places a woman named Ellen Futter, a great New Yorker who was the first woman president of the Museum of Natural History following her presidency of Barnard College. And she's a good friend of mine. And when I said I wanted to go into the museum, there had just been a Wall Street Journal cover story about the fact that, this is in the early 2000s, that Native American artifacts and bones were going to be returned, also in the news again now. But DNA made it possible to say, with all the bones on shelves, what tribal group. They couldn't identify Susan Hanafee by name, but they could say, these are Crow people, or these people are from Africa. So I wanted to get in to study the museum, and Ellen said, if you even think of killing someone in my museum, I will never talk to you again. And the quick way I got in, because all good things happen in libraries, I met a librarian at a mystery bookstore in New York that used to exist called Black Orchid. And when she heard what I wanted to do, she said, I'll get you in. There's a rare books library within the museum. And she said, come the day before Thanksgiving. Everybody's either traveling or cooking. No, Ellen will never know. I went in and found, to my surprise, that there are 4 levels underground in the museum with just things of all sorts on shelves. And the other thing for crime novelists is you realize you're always looking for places where bad things can happen. And with cameras, there are fewer and fewer of those, with surveillance cameras everywhere. And those old steel foundation, enormous buildings, my cell phone didn't work once I got to the 2nd level underground. I said, this is great. Alex Cooper, my character, will be in here. So occasionally there were roadblocks, and you looked for some intelligent, kind person to pass around the roadblock.
So, Susan, has anybody been very helpful to you in you have any
Well,
stories?
actually, there is someone that's been very helpful. I want to say first that my first understanding that someone other than an author sometimes does his or her research was about 40 years ago when I interviewed Jean Stone. She was the wife of Irving Stone, the author of Lust for Life. She was an amazing woman. And he would just say to her, go out and find out what the weather was like. And she would do it. And so when he when she died, she got a big obituary in the LA Times applauding her efforts. But my most helpful researcher on the island and friend is a man named Bo Hamrick. Please stand up, Bo. Okay, Bo has never met a detail he didn't love. And he deserves actually a big round of thanks for the work he is doing to upgrade the island's emergency communications. And of course, for all his help on my current and previous book. But the idea of Boca and some of its more prominent citizens as soft targets were something that Bo and Marcy Shortus and I discussed quite often in hushed tones, because we don't like to think of that. And we talked about the fact that there were only 2, sometimes 3 deputies to protect as many as 4,000 residents and visitors, some of them very wealthy and prominent. So, and also after Hurricane Ian, because there was no cell phone communication, the police and fire, there's no way they could talk to each other because they only used cell phones. Well, Bo would feed me this information. He would go to a meeting, he'd call me, and he'd say, "You'll never believe what I heard today." And I was like writing furiously. Okay, that goes in the book, that goes in the book. Better not put that in the book. So he actually felt compelled to do something about the situation as I was writing my mystery. And he started working with Chief Blosser, the fire chief. And as a result, they have raised almost $400,000 and have they're totally upgrading the communications system on the island, emergency communications. And I think all deserves a round. So not only did he help me, but he's playing a huge role in the your future safety as well. So sometimes researchers do amazing things other than help with books.
Great.
Sometimes authors just say, "You will have to drive this to conclusion."
I did say to him, "Bo, you're going to have to do this on your own." So,
Bobbie, what was a surprising finding in your research? What was the thing that most
I do
engaged
have
you?
one thing that really surprised me, and I think it'll surprise all of you when I tell you this. I didn't know about the illiteracy fact, but I should have known that because if a simple research on that phase of French history would reveal that most of the people were uneducated. But what surprised me was when the women came over to Canada and they were under the care of the nuns were providing them with some training, some education, quote unquote. They were learning to weave and to sew and to bake and to garden. And the indigenous girls in the area around the convents, they were receiving some training too. They were learning to read. And that was because the nuns wanted them to be able to read the Word of God. They weren't concerned about whether they would make good wives or not, whereas the French girls, that was what they were there for, and nothing else. And that really shocked me, and I still, when I talk about it, I feel, nervous just thinking how unfair it was to all those girls.
That's great. So, Susan, do you have something surprising?
well, I actually think I was surprised by the situation I discussed earlier about how lax the security was on the island and how bad the communication was. For this particular book, that was my big surprise and motivation, really.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just mention in my last book about about Absalom Markland, who was the Postmaster General for Grant during the Civil War, that going in, I knew about his work for the Postal Service and his work in delivering mail. What came as a huge surprise to me was his role in helping to get the 14th Amendment passed in Congress. And that just came as a big surprise to me and to most other, I think almost every other historian of the Grant presidency. So there are oftentimes some legal issues that can arise in writing. And for a historian, the biggest one of those would be copyright. Now, Copyright is different from plagiarism, okay? If you violate a copyright, it's different from plagiarizing. So if you quote a sentence from somebody else's book and you put it in quotation marks and you put a footnote or an endnote and you tell what book it came from, you have no issue with plagiarism. You have not plagiarized. But you can do all of that and still be guilty of violating a copyright. And that is because if you did not get a permission from that writer, you may be in violation of copyright. So in the United States, copyrights begin with the creation of a work, and if it's written before 1978, it would last 50 years after the death of the author. Don't worry about this. You can find it. After 1978, it's the life of the author plus 70 years.
Wow.
When that expires, then it's in the public domain, and you can freely quote it, but you still have to cite the work. I mean, that's still your responsibility. So for me, working in the Civil War, I'm pretty safe because basically all books published before 1929 and all newspapers before 1923 are in the public domain. But that's a legal issue to deal with. And I know Susan's had a legal issue. She mentioned...
Actually, tried to avoid legal issues. Two instances I remember. The first one was when I wrote my first book, Leslie's Voice. It involved a hostile takeover of one Midwestern utility by another. And when I finished the first draft, I took it to an attorney friend of mine. He said, "Oh no, this will never fly because you have written about people that I can read this book and tell who they are. So you could be facing some lawsuits." So I had to change names and genders in some cases, and race, and just make it as sort of obscure as I could to tell my story without irritating anybody to the point that they would go to an attorney.
So Linda, as I understand it, I've not seen it, you have one of the most wonderful places to write in the summer. And so the question I'm going to ask all of you here is, when and where do you write, and how do you manage all of your research materials? So we'll start with you, Linda.
Well, this is a pretty great place to write, too. I came here in 2017, and one of the things that really drew us here, aside from fly fishing for my husband, was that the beauty and the fact I just need light and sunshine and a window that I can look out and see water, ideally, to write. Before that, I started writing in the early 1990s, and we have a home on Martha's Vineyard, and that was my sanctuary. And we had a separate, calling it a cottage makes it elaborate, we call it the shack, but the shack was my writing place, and nobody could come to it except family, and I mean, after hours people could come. If they brought scotch, they were very welcome. But it just was incredibly peaceful, had a beautiful view. I just need quiet, and having a really pretty place makes a difference. My research is usually by hand in notebooks, and that's becomes very cumbersome with each book. And I'd say the bane of my husband's existence is traveling in the middle of writing a book, just going from, say, the vineyard down here, because I insist on taking, if you lose it, there's no backup for me. So every sail bag, every wheeler bag that has to be hoisted above has my research in it. And you know, best of all, Candy, what it's like to care for and care about and keep your research. But I take it everywhere I go.
Bobbie, how about you?
Well, as far as when I write, that's my first answer. I write most of the time at around 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning before I get ready for work. And it's really nice. I put on a set of headphones and I listen to instrumental music. And there's this one Irish musician I particularly like, and Colin McIntyre. And when I listen to his music, all of a sudden, my brain seems to say, okay, you're writing now. You know, it's a great programming device for me. And I always write on Sundays because I'm rested and I have the whole day. And as far as organizing my materials, what I do is I use a software program called Scrivener, which is a software program that was designed for authors. And it allows me to keep my different scenes and chapters organized and move them around if I want to. And it also gives me a place to catalog all my research, and it's all indexed, so I can look for one word and I can find everything about that topic. So that's very helpful.
Well, where I write, before I became a writer, my husband and I realized that we would be much happier if we each had offices in our home and they were as far apart in the structure as possible. So that's what we have, and I love my office here, and I love my office in Wyoming, where most of my books are. But as far as when, I usually write a bit every day, but I'm not on any kind of schedule. The spirit seizes me, and then the rest of the world just disappears, and my husband has to call me. Time for dinner. But how I keep my research, after you hear it, you'll understand why when Bobbie told me about Scrivener, my eyes lit up. So for my last book, I had printed out 12 three-ring binders worth of newspaper clippings. I mean, it was like this much in a shelf, and genealogical data. And I arranged it in strict chronological order, so I could just go by. I mean, when you're writing a biography or you're writing history, you're usually doing it in chronological order, and that works for me. But so I had those. I have many files on my computer that are loosely organized by subject and by date, but because on a Mac, which is what I use, you can go search for a word, and everything in your computer that has that word in it will pop up, so I can find it. When I work in archives, most of the time now you can photograph items, and I have thousands of photographs of letters on my iPhone in 18th century, 19th century cursive, and photos of documents. And I have more than 1,000 books in my libraries between here and there. And on my Kindle, I have books in, hundreds of books. But I'm thinking now I'm going to try Scrivener.
It'll help a little.
It worked.
It'll help a little.
And that I work better with hard copy. I work better still with paper than with a computer. But I'm going to give this a shot just because of exactly the thing that Linda said. Carrying books and notebooks and everything between houses. And you can't mail them, you can't UPS them because you can't insure them. They are insured for zero. Books, papers, zero. So that's it. But so I think with that we ought to open it up for questions, and I'd love to have questions that can come to the panel at large or to anybody individually. And we've got
A couple microphones.
a couple of microphones.
What process do you prefer if you do your research or the writing? Because eventually, after all this research, you need to write something, or theoretically. So do you have a preference, each one of you, for that process? Oh, darn, I'm done researching, now I have to write. Or I can't wait to start writing.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Well, I can answer.
Okay.
I feel exactly the opposite. I mean, when I wrote a Cummins history book, I had to interview 120 people, and then they all had to edit what I'd written. So I call that revisionist history book. And so I couldn't wait to start writing. And that's the way I feel. I mean, I start with an outline, and I want to write immediately and research as I'm writing. So I think that's because I'm a fiction writer. Obviously, I couldn't do that if I was researching a history book or something.
I'll pick up next. The writing life is very solitary. I mean, it's just you and your words. Some days the words come better than other days. Some days they don't come at all. I couldn't work with music in my ears. I could work with music in the background, but I'm talking to myself all the time and characters. So I love both. It's what I wanted to do, to write, but some days are so much better than other days till somebody reads the pages that you wrote that day. And for me, research is being out in the world, meeting interesting people, meeting people who love that you have an interest, except for Ellen Futter, in their work, in their place. I mean, they really are happy to show you around for the most part. And so it's very hard to stop, and there's always a point when you've had relationships with people you've done research with. The ones who are the best call 2 weeks later when you're in the solitary process and say, you know, I found something else that might really interest you. I hadn't looked for it before, but going with you to the stacks that day made me think of it. So for me, I love them both for different reasons. I'm a writer, so I'm supposed to love writing more, and it's a tough job when you are just alone with your own thoughts and research and words.
Yeah, it is. Well, I found when I first started this project, and I'm the novice in the group, but I found that I just didn't feel like I could write because I didn't know enough. And you know, I'm working with a professor on the project, and she said, you have to start writing. And once I did, then I realized, yeah, I don't know enough, but my imagination is going to fill in. That's what fiction is all about. And then as I learn more, I can always go back and revise. I can correct if I got something wrong. But it really was challenging at first, just to get that inertia. And like Linda said, the writing part is the hard part. It's easy to go down into that rabbit hole of research. It's hard to come out and make it, you know, put it into your own voice.
I enjoy both the research and the writing. And when I'm doing the research, that's what I love the most. And when I'm doing the writing and when you're on, that's, you know, it's like, wow, this is great. But one of the things that I love so much about research, it's sort of like what Linda says when she's talking to people and they're so excited. Well, I'm definitely dealing with dead people. So I'm reading dead people's mail, I'm looking at dead people's stuff. But just some of the things that you come across are just so amazing. So when I was writing my first book, Lincoln's Generals' Wives, and I went out to South Bend to Notre Dame Archives that has the William Tecumseh Sherman family papers and artifacts. And they've put all of the papers online, but they had these boxes of artifacts. And among the artifacts, when I went there, was this little box about this big, and it had 6 little brass buttons. And there was a note card attached to it from Ellen Sherman saying that these were the buttons from the little soldier's uniform that had been made for Willie Sherman, who died after the Battle of Vicksburg when they were visiting their William Tecumseh Sherman in camp. It was the real tragedy of the Shermans' lives to lose Willie, who was just 9 years old. Well, I started crying, and I have to tell you, it is not unusual in archives to hear people crying or people laughing, because sometimes you come across stuff that is just unbelievable. But so those are the kinds of things, and like Linda said, people will come back and tell you something, or a great and wonderful fun thing is that you may be able to fill in to an archivist or to somebody in a museum a bit of history about what they've got that they don't know. So I was at the Society of the Cincinnati House in Washington, D.C., to look at artifacts that had belonged to Robert Anderson, who's the subject of my next book. And he was the man who was in charge of Fort Sumter when the Confederates fired on it and started the Civil War. And his father had served in the Revolutionary War, so he was one of the founding members of the Society of the Cincinnati, and Robert was an honorary member, so they had things there. So I went to look. they had a fragment of that very flag that had flown over Fort Sumter that I got to see. I mean, that is just really rare. I mean, it was just unrolled right in front of me. But the other thing they had some portraits up that they weren't showing, but they took me upstairs to this whole area of portraits. And they went through and they said, well, here's a portrait of Robert Anderson, here's a portrait of his father, Richard, and then here's a portrait of Richard Jr., who was Robert's brother, but we don't really know that much about him. Well, I already knew about it. He had been our first minister to Columbia. He died while he was there, and Robert Anderson was with him and brought his body back on, by ship to be buried in Louisville. I mean, and they said, oh, wow, well, we really need to know that. And so you can exchange information.
Yeah.
Next question.
Right here.
Oh, yes, so interesting, pals, to hear what you have to say and to share both the fiction and the nonfiction perspective on research. My question is this. I assume that every writer would love to sell their books and to potentially make it into a movie and all those good things that come with an attachment to something you've written. How do you manage that interest when you decide on a topic that is going to be of interest to you?
I think all of us are writing books to write. And whether it becomes a movie interest, a TV series interest, more likely to happen with fiction than with non, it comes to you. I mean, most of us have either a literary agent or an editor. Those requests and questions come to the agent, for example. In my case, with the first of the mystery novels, somebody wanted to make it a TV series. And this is back when there was only ABC, NBC, CBS, no streamers, nothing like that. And we sold it to be made into a movie. And immediately, it's like they want to take the main character and make her a dog, or you sold your rights. They can do anything they want to the characters. And it was a 2-hour movie, and it didn't become a series. And I was thrilled that it didn't when I saw what they could do to your story, to the people in it. So it's, if you want to, and there are people who just want to have a movie made, and so they write something that they think is copying James Patterson or something really thrilling and fast-moving. So it's probably different for every writer, but I think those of us who want to write concentrate on the writing, and the outside interest often comes to us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think that you want people to read your books. I mean, sitting there and writing and spending all that time just writing for nobody, it's not quite as satisfying as thinking, well, I'm going to be writing, people are going to be reading what I wrote, and I always want my readers to enjoy my books, so I ask them. And I think, I know Linda does this a lot. It is, of course you would like to make money, of course you would like to have your book made into a movie, but she gives away books, I give away books, everybody gives away books, and it's about sort of the need in your soul to write. And I think that's as much as anything.
And my only comment on that would be to follow up on what Susan says. For a historian, it's all money out, because you have to pay to travel to archives. You have to often pay to get copies of things. You have to oftentimes pay for permissions to use a portrait of somebody in your book. And so I've told my husband, look, this is my golf club. Okay? Money in, enjoyment out.
Yeah.
That's great.
My question goes back again to your research. Have you ever been in that situation, or you've all talked about it, where you've found something so interesting in those archives, like you said about the buttons and that it actually turned your plot, the storyline, the book in a slightly different direction, so that you actually added that piece of information you never knew until you found it out in research, and now you use it for your book? That's it.
Well, as I mentioned in my most recent book, that's exactly what happened with the book about this man who was this employee of the post office, and I was so interested in what he did during the Civil War. And then as I tried to sort of, well, I said, but this is a biography and I have to keep looking until he dies. And then I found this whole other episode of his life where Grant had asked him to come back in. And I went and looked in the Congressional Record, which is like the world's smallest type, and read the weeks that they were debating the 14th Amendment and how his name kept coming up and what he had done and the man that he had hired and the run-in with the Ku Klux Klan was just this whole story unfolded. And at that point I said, oh my gosh, I can't be the first person to have found this. I was very unsure. So I started reading every book I could read about the 14th Amendment and the passage of them. I must have read 50 books about the passage of the 14th Amendment, and that appeared nowhere in there. And I kept thinking, okay, so I'm going to go with this. But it changed the book, and it made it a much more interesting book. So
it's a riveting story.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, yes, it's fascinating because I go into a place usually with an open mind about what I'm going to be introduced to. And if you think of driving along the East River Drive in New York, the East River and Roosevelt Island is in the middle. There's a tram going over, and a lot of crummy-looking buildings have been built there. But there's a spectacular old bones of a building that was in disarray till the state decided to restore it. And I started my research by going over and found out that it was designed, it's so beautiful because it was designed by the same architect who did St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. And the sad note, it was a smallpox hospital in the 1850s because they wanted something to be so beautiful that when they put people on boats to be taken over to the hospital, they would think they were going to a sanitarium that was magnificent and would come back alive. And behind the facade, behind the whole hospital, was a mortuary because 90% of the people never came back. But it changed the story. I mean, that was not going to be a big part of the story. I was going there for a different reason about Roosevelt Island and its history. And the book the book is The Dead House because it's about the hospital and the morgue, and that's an old Scottish word for morgue, dead house. So totally, if you go in with an open mind, and it's entirely different than Candy's historical research and that really fascinating piece of history that you found. But this is just exposing something that was known at the time and written about, but was just, it's such a magnificent structure to this day and had such a cruel purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't had that experience, but I sometimes, even though I work from an outline, I will be working on something and I'll find a piece of information that maybe tweaks my book a little bit, or sometimes the most fun thing is when a character emerges from out of nowhere. And I had that happen in one book, and she was so intriguing. She was from New York, and she was kind of a slutty lawyer. And
She looks at me. Wait. Thank you.
And so I kept her in the book, and she wasn't part of the original plan. So
Thanks.
So, Bobbie, do you have anything to add to
No,
that?
I'm really so much at the beginning, so, I can't tell you about how it may have changed my course in my work, but as I've discovered different aspects to the history and to the gaps in history, it's actually propelled me forward to try to create a story. How do you do that out of just the historic facts for a person whose voice is not heard? And that was really quite an enlightening experience to realize that, oh yes, that's where you go into yourself and you find that character and you find that character in society today, or you find something similar that you then translate into that backdrop. And that's a really interesting experience. So not having the knowledge has affected my process quite a bit.
Hi. Well, this is for everybody, but I love to read history books, and I thought of this question by seeing David McCulloch's name here, and also I like Nathaniel Philbrick. What I wanted to know, and maybe Candy, you will be the one that would have this, do you gather facts and do you keep them? Do you store them? So when you write the next book about Grant, can you use some of the research you've done before? Because I think somebody like Nathaniel Philbrick, I mean, he was white, knows everything there is about boats, but he wrote about the Mayflower, he wrote about the Battle of Yorktown, but it was always about the boats, and I think he stored a lot of information. I wonder if you do that, like about the Second World War. You know, you have these books about that take place in France, and you talk a lot about.
Well, certainly for me, you know, whatever I learn and what I store in whatever format I store, I still have it all. And I end up going back and using it again. As long as I'm staying in the Civil War era, I could do that because, it's all the same people in the hood, and, it's all the same stuff. Now, each book, I have to learn something new about it. But I think that's really the case. It's just everything is kept. I can tell a quick little anecdote about David McCullough's research that I found to be just utterly amazing, and that is that his books are amazing, and he does a huge amount of research, and he also has a small little cabin that he would write in and have only the books relating to that particular book he's writing there. And he did a lot of research himself, but he also had this amazing researcher named Mike Hill, who spent a lot of time on one of his books at the Library of Congress, and I met him there. But his method, because he was so popular and so fabulously, best-selling. I mean, Linda's been on the New York Times best-selling list right along with David McCullough. And so the books were making lots of money. He would just go and write his books, use whatever he needed. He might make a mark on the manuscript, but he would not do the footnotes or the endnotes as he went along. And when he was done, they would pack up that entire cabin with all of the books and all of the researcher's notes and his manuscript, and they sent them out to a woman in Wyoming who I sat next to at lunch one time, and she had to put together all of those books with the manuscript. And it kept her very well employed for many years. But that is a luxury that almost nobody has.
Great story.
Today, how will AI affect your research?
In ways that I don't yet understand, starting it off. My nephew was down here last year visiting, and I said, I don't know how it works, and he went to chatbot or whatever thing it is, and he said, write the first 2 paragraphs of a Linda Fairstein murder mystery featuring Alexandra Cooper, the prosecutor. And I'd say it was less than 3 minutes, and there were 2 paragraphs. They were generic. They weren't as detailed as I would hope I would do. And my husband said, I'll give you a lot of money if you write the next 350 pages so I can spend more time with her. But, I just can't even imagine. I don't know how it affects history. I mean, fiction less dramatically.
Well, my first experience with AI was as I was starting. I mentioned to you, you have to figure out if there's enough there, or what else has been written. And so I was trying to find out if indeed there was a biography of Robert Anderson. I certainly thought there should have been. All of my historian friends thought there should have been. I could not find one. So I went on to ChatGPT and I said, list biographies of Robert Anderson, and boom, came 5.
Whoa.
They did not exist.
Wow.
They did not exist. The authors might have existed, but they didn't write that book. The books might have existed, but they weren't really about Robert Anderson. I mean, it was just shocking. And with every new AI bot that I learn about, like Citadel and some of these others, that's sort of my go-to question, because all AI is, as I understand it, is basically taking whatever is given to it, whatever is put into it, whatever, as they call it, whatever that particular bot scrapes from the universe, and then they regurgitate it. And so it's basically garbage in, garbage out. If you don't have enough about the subject, then it will just make up something unless it's really well disciplined. So,
Right.
but I'm hopeful that there will be more, because it would be so helpful. And I keep thinking at some point there will be, in the 19th century, they did a lot of what they called cross-writing, where they would write a letter this way, and then they would turn the page and they would write across this way. And sometimes they would turn it again and write across this way. And it's almost impossible to decipher, even on a computer, even writing it out. I hope AI figures out how to deal with cross-writing. That would be wonderful.
I'm just curious to know if you work with editors and what that is like.
Okay. I work with an editor. I work with an independent editor that I pay. My first book was, I sold it as a manuscript, and it was 600 pages of double type pages. And when the publisher bought it, they said, but you have to cut 250 pages out. And I just knew I couldn't cut it out, because, as you know well, the saying, you have to kill your darlings. You just don't want to do it. So my agent suggested this editor, and she has been absolutely terrific. And so she helped me with that. And then with this last book, she helped me write a proposal, and I would send her individual chapters as I went along the way, and she was incredibly helpful. And so,
Yeah, I usually work with people that I know. Like, I always have Bobbie read my first draft. This year, I tracked down 3 editors that I didn't know, because your friends have trouble saying to you, this isn't a good book. So the first one was actually my favorite, because he read my book and then he said he thought it was good, but he thought I should rearrange part of the book and bring this certain chapter up front and then combine another chapter. And then basically he thought it would be better. And he was so right. And that's what you look for when you're looking for editors. I don't need someone to tell me that I've misspelled a word, but I need someone to say, this will make your book more readable. And I think it's really important to get a second set of eyes, a third set, however many sets you can afford before you say, okay, I'm not going to make this much money on this book, so I'm done. But yeah, the first one was just terrific, and it was a really good experience. So
I have the good fortune of being published by large publishing houses, and you always get an editor. And I dreamed of having Maxwell Perkins, no Hemingway, no Fitzgerald. But and I was very fortunate with my first editor, who would just take a word and say, Alex Cooper wouldn't call her boyfriend her beau. It's just, she's too young and it's not a word. So from that to just telling you suggesting what to move forward or back, you don't have to take every suggestion. The only person, often in many cases in mine, who has ever read the pages before my editor did has been my husband. I've had 2 of them and they've both been great. But at the end of a day where you have just been in a room writing and thinking, and we'd always have a cocktail together, and and my late first husband, who was with me from the first book, would just start making little X's. And my real brilliant editor would circle, make the X's, but she'd put a check, and I showed it to Justin, and he said, "What are those green checks?" And I said, "That's actually something she liked." And I would suggest I give you a green pen, and beside the X's and the crossouts, you put the occasional check mark next to the check. And it's tough. There were some tough nights, as there are with Mike, where you just say, "This doesn't work for me. You haven't explained who the person is. The dialogue isn't snappy. This drags." And a great editor, really my personal ones, but the professional editors that I've had have made a huge difference for the better. And publishers give you the editor with publishing houses. So it's a great part of the process.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, if we have one. Emerson.
This, and Candy, I thought my question was for the other three, but I think it includes you. It's basically, if you see your storyline going this way, how do you squash it down? And I've been working, my life's work is dealing with 4 families, with fascinating, horrible people. The joys of getting older, now they're all dead, so no one can sue them. That just makes the storyline get bigger. Would you, in your experience, would you focus on one family, on one generation? How do you squash stuff down?
I think he was asking you all first.
4 books.
But yeah, well.
Start one with the most interesting character or aspect that you want, see how long it goes. I mean, for me and you, it's very different with crime fiction because pacing is so important. You lose the reader if you drag on too much without an event happening. But if you're doing, it sounds like biography and history, we'll throw it back to Candy. But there's no need to put it all in one book. You can write 2, 3, 4 books if you think a series. That one character can start it and hold your attention and your reader's attention. Don't chop it down.
Yeah, I think when I'm writing, I remember the book I read by Nelson DeMille. It was a great author. It was called Nightfall. I can't remember when it came out. It was about the TWA Flight 800, and there was a theory that it was shot down by a terrorist missile, which they now refer to as a conspiracy theory. But sometimes those are the best theories. Anyway, 3/4 of the way through it, I thought, he lost his way and didn't know where his characters were going or where his book was going. And I just had that feeling. And then he ended up killing off a bunch of people in the 9/11 terrorist attack. And then after I finished the book, it was kind of unsatisfying. And I read where he had actually lost his way and gone to his son and said, "What should I do about these characters?" And he said, "Dad, kill them off in the terrorist attack." So I think it is easy sometimes to lose your way. And I always think of that when I'm writing. Don't do that. Don't lose your way and discipline yourself. And that's kind of why I like to work from an outline. So I can change my outline, but I like to have that discipline.
And I think that when you're writing, you have to ask yourself, what is the story that you're telling here? What is the story that you want to tell? That will sort of center your mind. So you can have other characters, but are they crucial to the story that you really want to tell? Mm-hmm. And I think it sounds simple, but I think you can have multiple plot threads, but they has to make sense to the main story that you're telling.
That's a good point.
And I think that's right. When I wrote my first book, and I was trying to look at women, wives of officers who, where the women had gone to see Lincoln and had gone to ask Lincoln to help their husbands. You know, there were a number of different options, and I could have had more women or I could have had fewer women, and I just kept moving back and forth, so I ended up with 4, 2 for better, 2 for worse. But it was really, what kind of story am I telling? What do I want to give people a sense of what it was like to have been a woman in that time and needing to get assistance from the commander-in-chief.
I think Lindsay had it. Did you have a question? Oh, okay.
Well, Susan, Linda, Bobbie, Candy, I think we need more time. But another date, maybe?
Yeah, no.
There are lots of good questions. So thank you all very much
Thank
for being
you.
here. And thank
Thank you.
That was fun.